One, we will begin tonight with a Pledge of Allegiance. If you'd all please stand and join me.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right. I've asked Commissioner Hayman to give us a thought and or prayer tonight, so we'll turn some time over to her.
So for the first time in 15 months, I walked through those doors, which are now different doors, I would point out. Different doors, different technology, different chairs. People are placed in different places. And yet I'm delighted. I'm delighted to be back. It feels a little like coming home in a way. For the last 6 years, I've had the privilege of being on this planning commission. I'm gonna get teary. I think this is it. This is gonna be the last time that I speak and give a thought or a prayer. And it's been, I didn't think I was gonna get emotional. It's been an honor to work with all of you. It's been an honor to work with amazing commissioners and incredible staff. Our city is so lucky to have this group of people here. So I just want to say thank you for allowing me to do this for the last 6 years. It really has been my honor and privilege. Woo! I didn't think I was supposed to bring Kleenexes. That's all. I don't have anything more deep than that, so thank you.
That's good. No, that is good. Thank you, Shaylin. I know that I've, looked forward to hearing what you had to say and look to you for guidance on things, so thank you. All right, let's move along then. We'll start with our first item of business on the agenda. This is an administrative decision scheduled for a public hearing. We have a small subdivision waiver, lot split for property located at 270 East, 400 South. Something we've actually looked at before, I guess. So we'll turn the time over to staff.
Okay, thank you, Chair Daly and members of the commission. I'm just trying to get the site plan fully visible. So this item was heard last March. A small subdivision is a subdivision of 2 lots. And that when you split a lot into 2 or create a subdivision of 2 lots, it can waive other subdivision requirements. That's why it's called a small subdivision waiver. So the Planning Commission saw this last year. It is on 400 South and 400 East. It's there's an old house on 400 East that is a family property that they have split through the county, and now they just need to get the subdivision rights to build on this second eastern lot, as you can see. I'm just realizing YouTube can't see anything. I know you guys can't see any of this, but there we go. Okay, so as we saw last year, on the graph in this, they meet the majority of the requirements, and we did not see this plat last year, so this is new information that we didn't have last year. There are still a few things that need to be provided before this plat could be recorded at the county. Namely, they need to include the 2,000 square foot buildable area on each lot, and then provide public utility easements. There are already the 2 on the street frontages, but there are also required 7-foot easements along interior property lines. Staff does recommend that this is approved. It was approved last year. Nothing has really changed since then, just that we've received a bit more information. Staff does recommend it with the conditions in the staff report, and those are mostly items that need to be taken care of on the plat so it can be recorded properly. So if you have any questions, I'll take them.
Great. Thanks, Mackenzie. Does anybody have any questions for staff?
Mackenzie, on the utility easements, when you say interior, it's on both sides of the property, so you'll effectively have, I guess, 4 utility easements, is that correct?
Yes.
Am I hearing that correctly?
So interior, so there's 2 7-foot interior PUEs, public utility easements. They don't have to go necessarily on the interior lot lines, they could go on the rear and one side. So the applicant has some choice in that, depending on if there are any existing utilities anyway. But yeah, more would need to be added, especially to lot 2. Corey, can you answer if lot 1 needs 2 7-foot, or if the 10-foot for both street count?
The way the subdivision ordinance lists it, it'll be 1 front, 1 side, and 1 rear. And so they'll need to provide that. They can jointly, if they choose to, they can jointly put it in that center line and put a 7-foot on each side, and that would satisfy for both lots in that case.
Corey, you're saying that it'll have to go along the rear of
The
the
one-
westerly?
Yeah,
lot?
that'll be the
Is there
rear
a-
yard.
What's the, when I zoom in, I can't see that dimension. Is there enough room for a 7-foot utility easement? I would imagine so, but I just can't see that dimension.
And I don't think this is a good enough scan
Okay,
to
we
show
could
that.
ask the applicant.
But Corey, you're saying the interior one, so we're talking about that north-south line right in the middle.
Right? They could choose that, and it would satisfy both
they'd like
lots
it.
for that. And then there would be on the new lot, there would be a rear one.
But not on the old one?
Right, 'cause you have the
Okay,
3
then
easements
that
already.
answers my question, thank you.
Okay.
I have a question. Do you know, with how the lot is divided right here, there's that little jut that goes in. And just as a reminder, this 81 foot frontage, that would be enough to, in your opinion, it says likely a build area, but with the setbacks of this little jut right there, do you think there would be an issue of putting a house there? I mean, I guess they could just put it
Put it deep in the lot.
deep in the lot or something and have a really
Yeah, our minimum lot width for that zone is 60 feet.
60.
And
That's
so
what I was
80
wondering.
would be sufficient, and now just comes down to where do they want to place the home for their particular chosen design?
And I guess they could build the home accordingly. That's a little bit more. Okay, great. And I know this is obviously not a flag lot. It is a flag sort of shaped look, which sometimes people get interested in. Can you just remind us what the actual definition of what would be the frontage of a flag lot, and what would that look like exactly?
Well, as you recall, the flag lot ordinance has been rescinded by the city council, so it doesn't exist, but the previous ordinance, the stem was a 25-foot width.
25.
And so that's what defines a flag, is anything that's below that minimum 60-foot width.
Great. So this is well in the guidelines of what we have, so thank you.
Perfect. Anybody else have any more questions for staff? Okay.
I have a question. So the aerial in the report showed some buildings on the, I don't want to call it the flag lot, but the
New lot.
new
let's call
lot.
The second lot?
What are those buildings?
So those are garages at this point, sheds, because originally the owner of the home on 400 East used that all. I believe it was for business purposes, but I understand that the plan is to either incorporate those or demolish those, but the applicant can talk about.
Sure. I guess, I just want to make sure that administratively, do we need to have any other requirements for those remaining buildings now that we're creating a new lot with buildings on them?
That is a good question.
Yeah, we
They
usually,
Mason brings up a good point, because
Because they wouldn't meet
you'd have
the-
a side yard
well,
setback.
you'd have
wouldn't you?
accessory buildings without a primary use, and so, yes, that's a great point. We usually add a condition that says you either take them down, or you put up a bond, or sometimes we put a plat note that you have 1 year. So maybe we could just look at some previous staff reports and add a condition on that. Whatever's acceptable. If they're planning on taking them down, that's the best, and that's what our ordinance requires. But we have done some of these alternatives, like you either tear them down in a year, or you post a bond So maybe I guess you could mention any of those in the condition.
Because our ordinance says 18 total, 8, 10, 10, 8, 9, 9 on side yards.
For the main building, the primary.
Right. I would just, it would be a non-conforming. We just, I'd want to avoid 50 years down the road, we find out that it was just sold to a third party and there's just garages there.
Right.
Right, yeah, you don't, and that's why we say you have to have the primary use, because you don't want a residential lot with just a storage unit on it.
Yeah.
And so, that's a great point.
Okay.
I didn't see that on the aerial.
That's all I had.
Okay. So let's turn the time over to the applicant, if you'd like to come forward and particularly address those auxiliary buildings. Let's put you right here in the middle, if you would, please. Introduce yourself and tell us.
Oh, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Bradley Trump. I am the owner of the parcel, the Lot 2. That was something that I came into ownership with from my family. It was not subdivided, but rather parceled separately from my grandmother in 1979. Following my grandfather's death, my dad, Ronald Trump, held his construction business, and so the building that you see on the aerial view on Google Maps and such is a 3-bay shop with a large rear shop, which is where we stored heavy equipment, construction equipment, and things of that nature. It's a cinder block building. So with that, the anticipation or the plan was to simply use those 3 bays in the shop as my garage, and we still operate to a very minimal level some of our equipment and stuff like that for side projects and stuff. My mother still owns a backhoe from my father's business. I store it in the shop there, and so, but that's what my intention was, is to forego building a garage just adjacent to the home and just use the existing structure as a garage.
Would that be attached to your home?
No, in no way attached to the home. The home, as planned, is, if I can recall correctly, 36 feet wide by about 50-ish feet deep. And so it would fit on the grassy area with the rear of the home approaching close to. You can see there's a bit of a green line, whereas there's some trees that separate the shop, and there's a parking driving area and then the grass, and that's about where the rear of the home, we have it set back. The front of the home will match about the same front placement of other homes in the area. It's not going to be sticking way out far, and we're not going to bring it way deep in back. But no, it's got well over 30 feet before it, away from the shop, in the shop area. I can't recall if I addressed all of the questions. I know that I talked about the shop there.
Yeah, that was the main question, for sure. And then the placement of the home, which you've addressed that as well, so.
And the easements, I think.
Oh, yeah, easements. You've got some options.
Yeah.
So do you have an idea of how you would like to implement those options, or?
Yes, well, I mean, I'd be fine with all of them. I think doing the easements, there's going to be plenty of room on all sides, the sides of the thing. I'd probably just go right down the center, the 7 feet on both sides with the frontage. Is probably what I would do. Ask my surveyor to do.
Okay, sounds good. Anybody else have any more questions for the applicant? Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So this matter has been scheduled for a public hearing, and we'll take the time now to invite any member of the public present that'd like to speak, step forward and do so. Okay, I'm seeing some shaking of heads. Seeing nobody here to speak to the matter, I'm going to go ahead and close the public hearing. All right, any other further discussion? We can talk about how we would like to address that auxiliary building. Sounds like he's going to keep it and use it as an auxiliary building.
I have a question for Corey with that. Corey and I recently spoke about accessory buildings that were detached from homes, and I'd love for you to give us a little bit of information of how that applies in this situation.
Just on the sizing issue.
Just on setbacks.
Placement,
and
placement,
size,
placement.
Placement, yeah.
In the case here, the structures are legally non-conforming, so they will exist, but let's just wipe that clean and just talk about accessory buildings. Currently, accessory buildings are allowed. We had some debate about this a few years ago, about whether the changing of setbacks should take place. It was temporarily changed, and then it came up later that some residents disagreed with some of the changes that were made. And so we revisited it, and what ultimately is adopted today now is that accessory buildings that are less than 400 square feet can go to a 3-foot setback. Now, anything less than 200 square feet doesn't need a permit, so that's your tough shed, as we nickname them. But anything under 400 will end up being a 3-foot setback, and it doesn't erase the fire code issues that are associated with that. If it is over 400 or more, then it's a 5-foot setback for the building. Accessory buildings are also regulated on height, and our ordinance calls out 2 standards to use. The first default standard is the building code, and if the building code does not address it or it's taken out, then there's a default standard as a backup. But the building code does have a standard, and that standard it's a standard of measurement, so we have a limitation of 20 feet in height, and that standard is from average grade to midpoint of roof. And so part of our discussion was, there's been some larger accessory buildings, particularly in heights, and what they perceive or not perceive to do to the backyard areas, and that's the controversy is probably a little bit on how height is measured, and then I think the other controversy is the sizing. We do not adopt what constitutes accessory building size, but we do what constitutes accessory uses. So garage, things of that nature, accessory uses, so we allow them, but we do not have a limitation on the sizing, other than your overall lot can only be 60% used up in impervious surface.
Yep.
Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, it was more than what we needed, I think. It was great.
I have a tendency to do that.
It's good information to have.
So back to this one, though, you said that they are non-conforming.
How are they non-conforming, maybe, is the question?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so
yeah,
are they well, they're non-conforming because they are accessory buildings without a primary building, or because of the placement?
Right now, they're attached with the home, so they're not non-conforming as far as their use. But they, from looking at the aerial, I haven't measured it, it looks like it potentially may be a non-conforming to a setback sizing. Now, that's what you're addressing with the question about once the division takes place, now it would introduce a use nonconformity rather than a structural nonconformity. And we don't want to promote additional nonconformities. We want them to correct in some way. And so that's what you're debating on, particularly in these buildings, is how do we ensure that if the primary use is not constructed, that we don't add, as indicated, 50 years from now and there's storage sheds,
But even if
Or 2 years from now.
or 2 years.
But even if the primary building is built, if the home is built there, do we potentially run into some nonconformity based on placement, right? Because,
Oh, yeah, then it would now no longer be a nonconforming use because the primary building would be built, but they would remain legally nonconforming as far as setbacks. Because we just can't retroactive an existing structure.
So
Now, there is limitations to expanding them and making them bigger and things like that under the nonconformities, but the Board of Adjustment is in charge with looking at
Or are we
those.
prohibited from approving that based off of
yeah,
non-compliance with setback?
are we headed for a Board of Adjustment?
No, because it's legally nonconforming.
Yeah.
It's there.
So if we just had a condition, like we sort of mentioned, that said building, within a certain amount of time, a primary residence, then that would solve this issue of just leaving it there.
Right, because if you let them stay, it's increasing the degree of nonconformity.
Right.
And that's what's
Because of the
prohibited.
use, yeah.
But we can't go in and recorrect.
Right.
the
But that's what I
nonconformity.
mean, like, that's why I asked, are we headed for Board of Adjustment? So if, the applicant wants to keep the building, which is understandable, but we put a primary building in there, we could be non-conforming still because of setback.
It will stay, if it doesn't meet the 5-foot setback because of the size that I'm just estimating, it would be.
Effectively, you're substituting your primary use as it relates to the accessory building, because you're building a new home there.
Yeah.
So this home
Just becomes,
functions as
Yeah.
the primary to the existing building, and then
Yeah.
you're substituting a new home and not using it, so
Yeah,
I guess one could argue that.
But I do want to recognize your point that it doesn't alleviate the nonconformity of setbacks.
right.
And that will remain in place, and whatever code restrictions there may be will continue to be that limitation on that situation.
I agree with Corey on the existing non-conforming use. This is, I think those buildings are a significant new issue tonight that has been raised, because our ordinance says you cannot create a lot that will create an illegality. And you cannot have 2 garages on a residential lot without the primary building. So that is our ordinance. So what I would suggest is our conditions say, if you want it, you could table it, and staff can go research, because we've done this a couple times. Prior to that, tear it down. And most of the time, they do want to tear it down, so that's why it doesn't come up very often. But I can think of 2 times, and I tried to search, but I couldn't think of the names that those are under. But we can go see what we put on the plat, but my suggestion would be that we go with the standard that's in the code, which says you have to tear those buildings down before you can record the plat, or you enter into some other acceptable arrangement or agreement with the city to either tear them down within a reasonable amount of time or post a bond. And I don't know, I guess we can look at what that time frame is, or if the planning commission wants to set that in there, but typically you need to get that primary building in there, within a couple years.
So your concern is more with the existence of the primary building.
Yes, I'm not worried about
Yeah.
the buildings being
setbacks.
there. It's just that the planning commission cannot approve this lot split with those buildings without a primary use.
So,
Unless there's a condition,
Right, unless you condition it
yes.
to do something about it within a reasonable amount of time.
Which I don't think we need to condition to have him tear it down, because he's literally just said he wants to keep them. So if we had a condition that says specifically to bond, or could you also have a condition that says something about creating a primary building by a certain amount of time?
Well, my recommendation is still status, ordinance requirement, you tear it down before you record the plat, or. So we give them that option, and like I said, I'm not prepared, I would like to find out what we've done in the past to come up with something, but those are my 2 ideas, is
Yeah.
we either require them to bond, but I don't love that.
If I just wanted to ask a couple of questions. It's, based on what I see, it's unripe for administrative decision. And we could ask the applicant if Chair Daley, if we want to kind of go out of order and see what he would be willing to do, perhaps even just ask for a couple of weeks and allow staff and he to negotiate options, because we don't need decision by committee necessarily.
yeah, I think we got some questions here, right, that have been raised that it would be nice to have some answers.
I can give you 3 options that the commissions in the past have approved. One is a note on the plat that you take it down within a 12-month period. The other one was a bond that they posted, and then there was one more. I think they took the building down before the recordation of the plat.
Well, or a third option would be build the primary building within 12 months or something like that.
Yeah, that's the reverse order of,
Yeah.
I like that better.
Or, yeah, so I'm going to make a few general comments. Number one, I don't think any of us want to put undue burden on an applicant where we don't have to. So my question would be, is there an allowance to allow him to build his primary structure before the lot subdivision. Now, that may have some financing, lender issues, but will that comply? Okay, Lisa, you've already answered that question.
Unless it's zoned for multifamily.
That's true. Okay, thank you. Sorry, that's an easy response that I didn't see. So I will say generally, the accessory building, and this is off topic but on topic, is an issue we need to address at some point.
It's on our goals.
Because, well, that's accessory dwelling units as opposed to
that's-
ancillary accessory buildings. Because what I see in the code, and tell me if I'm wrong, Lisa and Corey, but you could build two very, very large accessory buildings with smaller setbacks than primary residences. And that, to me, doesn't make sense at all from a safety, fire issue standpoint. You could have two effectively large homes in terms of massing right next to each other, but you couldn't have two homes right next to each other. It doesn't make any sense to me at all.
Yeah,
I
I just say, I'm gonna read in next to each other, I'm assumption that anytime you have a building and a separate building, it'll be a 6-foot distance, so, but 6 foot could still be considered right next to
Well,
each
so
other.
for example, on this, if I pull up Google Maps, there is another accessory building right adjacent to this one that could potentially be larger than what it is. So you could have, in this case, specific case.
But that's a
two very,
nonconformity situation, and the Board of Adjustment then has the duties to look for whether they'll allow an expansion of a
But there,
nonconformity.
even in a new case, there could be someone.
In it, well, in theory, if you have a large lot, you could have, let's just say you have a 1,500 square foot home, and you could have a 3,000 square foot barn, and then you could have another hay storage area 6 feet away from that barn, and that could be 700 square feet. So yeah, you're right. As long as the lot doesn't exceed the 60% impervious permit.
And I'm just thinking, look at their neighbors to the south, when you have those types of uses,
Or to the east.
or to the, whatever it might be, particularly on the south side, you could have two very, very large structures. So that's beside the point, but on point as we think about
Yep.
these things in the future, in terms of setbacks and massing and land use planning, how buildings shape our environment here in Centerville.
Right.
So, I would like to hear from the commissioners on how you'd feel about proceeding with conditions or potentially tabling for more information. And, obviously, we want to do what's right. That's kind of what we're tasked with doing as well. But we don't want to, in my opinion, I don't think we want to delay the applicant if we don't have to. So, thoughts, anybody?
I have thoughts, but I would say that it's unripe for decision, that I don't think that we should be imposing conditions without further evaluation by the experts and in dialogue with the applicant. So I would be inclined to either deny the waiver, which I don't think is a great idea, or ask for it to be tabled, or inquire whether or not it's to be, if the applicant wants something else.
Okay. Shaylin, did you have?
I agree. I think that based on the issues that have been raised, it makes sense to allow the applicant to get with staff and talk it through, and then bring it back to us and when it is right.
Okay.
I'm of the same mind. I mean, Lisa's helped us outline
Yeah.
the ordinance. I mean, we don't get to,
Yeah.
it's an administrative decision.
It is an administrative decision. I think, I don't think that deny is probably the right approach here because it's not,
Well, technically, if, I'm sorry to interrupt.
that's okay.
Imagine theoretically an applicant said, no, I want you to make a decision. I would deny it.
Yeah.
That's why you maybe asked to.
Yeah. But is there a moratorium or any kind of delay period or tolling if we deny something? Is there on some applicants, you can't reapply for a year or something?
Yeah, I know we have an ordinance for rezones, I don't
Yeah.
know if we have it for
I don't
these,
know.
for subdivision.
I should know that, but I
Yeah,
don't.
I can-
Well, there's no reason to make
No,
the
there's
applicant.
I was gonna say, if we deny,
I
does
don't know
that,
if I would deny, if I had to make a decision today, I don't think I would deny it. I think we've done this enough that, you know, Lisa has given us some options, Corey has given us some options. I mean, I'm fine to table if the majority wants to table and get a better dialogue going, but I do think we could come up with something today if we needed to, that was similar to what Lisa or Corey suggested, so.
I move that we table it.
Second.
thank you. We have a motion and a second. That was
Mason.
Mason.
You said move, so I was waiting. She said move, so I wasn't sure if it was a motion. So I'm
Yes.
glad
She
that,
moved, yeah. No, I think that's fair. We've got some significant questions about, you know, how to address some nonconformities that I think we would like to have some answers for. And so the direction, well, after we vote on this, assuming that the motion passes, would be to have the applicant and staff work together to resolve these issues and come back to us. As soon as in-
Christina or Becky have any further input?
I agree, I think that's good.
This could come back as soon as our next meeting, couldn't it?
I do have, well, I don't know, never mind.
Okay. Sounds good then. Any other discussion about our motion? All right. Then we will start with Commissioner Hayman.
Aye.
I was just gonna go down the row, sorry.
No, that's fine. Go
Aye.
Aye.
ahead.
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
Sorry.
So we have, motion passes. We will have you talk about it with staff and get some of those questions resolved and come back to us then. Thank you. Okay, let's move along then to our next item on the agenda. This is a legislative decision, has been scheduled for a public hearing as well. This is for a PDO conceptual site plan zone map amendment for lots 2 and 3 of the Legacy Crossing PDO. We'll turn the time over to staff.
Thank you, Chair Daley. McKinsey, who is the master control guru, let's try to look at the landscape plan just for visual.
Just a moment.
Thank you very much. You've, as a commission, have seen this before. This has come to you when they wanted to modify the site in its layout and parking and detention needs. You saw this with some retail buildings and an office building. And that went up to the city council. It was passed by the city council, but it was conditioned upon some development agreement amendments that contractually reflect what the approval is. And during that time, my understanding is the applicant came to a decision in the marketing of the property and what they anticipate to do in their future, that the office building was not viable for the property. So this is returning back to the Planning Commission for the PDO amendment. We are looking at removing of the office building and the architecture that you'd previously seen, so there'll be no more amendments to the materials. So we'll return back to the standard material selections that are established by that PDO. They will continue to, they're not changing the general uses, which was general office, general retail, general restaurant, that was originally approved for the whole project. But they would like to add the recreational vehicle sales. That was discussed with them. We had a discussion at staff as well as the applicant, and my understanding is they will just simply market for some of their space for vehicle sale, recreational vehicle sales, and it will be done completely within a closed building. Another use they'd like to add was the vehicle sales. They had some specialty retail sales for the vehicles, and they figured that it wouldn't take more than 10 spaces for the display of those specialty vehicles. And so we're reflecting that again. And it was a conditional use. We wanted to use the control of the conditional use because it's a shared parking area, shared uses, and just wanted to make sure that if there is an outdoor display area, that it's appropriately located. So the other uses and the tenants are not negatively affected. And so the conditional use, my understanding is they've agreed to continue on with that. And then there was also a discussion that one of the buildings, they'd like to do a drive-through facility as part of a tenant space, and that hasn't changed on their exhibits. And so from staff's perspective, it just eliminates what we thought about an office building and architecture. Sad, because office space is viable and usable for a piece of property, but we have a lot of office space in the city, so if they believe they could market it for the retail, good, because we like the retail sales. And it's been a while for these lots to be in the market to develop. It's been 10 years now, so it would be nice to develop the property and complete that project. One item that's a little bit different is the way the parking counts work under the PDO and our ordinances. The original plan would have borrowed stalls from the rest of the site, so they wanted to reintegrate back into that site to borrow the excess stalls. In this case, they will be providing excess stalls, and they still want to integrate back into the development and be a part of that master plan regardless. So now we'll be able to have some cross parking again for the entire project. And they wanted to go ahead with the opportunity to rejoin the shared parking arrangements for the other 4 lots. So, well, actually 3. So we're recommending approval. So I only changed those elements that took out the office. So hopefully I didn't miss something in the report.
Okay. No, that's good, Corey. So, I guess in summary, we're kind of reverting back to the way this was before.
Yes,
In a
it
lot of
was slated for this type of use plus a restaurant. And so we're going back to that, but it's a reconfigured site. And so that's what, as part of a PDO, a conceptual development plan has to be submitted. And since they're reconfiguring the site from its original layout, we're just readopting a new layout plan.
Since they're changing it from their previously approved layout.
Correct. It was a medium box with a sit-down restaurant.
Gotcha.
Configured a little bit different in the parking, but they will still maintain that shared design landscaping between the Megaplex lot and theirs, as you can see on the top part of the graph.
All right, does anybody else have any questions for staff on this one?
Corey, the drive-through, I'm guessing, is between buildings 2 and 3, is that correct? Where that island is on the east side of the island, where the handicap stalls are at?
I didn't look at the drive-through location.
Save that question for the applicant.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought we'd ask staff first, but,
Yeah.
okay.
What if you get a Chick-fil-A in there?
There's already a Chick-fil-A.
Sorry.
Raising Cane's, I think, is what they're
Yes.
saying. That's what they're, I was concerned about.
All right. Anybody else have any questions for staff? Okay, then let's invite the applicant to come forward, introduce yourself, speak to any of the items in the staff report, answer Commissioner Summerhays' question, and if you'd introduce yourself, go ahead.
Yes, my name is Mitch Vance. I'm with JF Capital, 1216 Legacy Crossing Boulevard, Suite 300. It's good to be back with you all. You know, I go to a lot of these meetings, and this is my first one back too. And I used to be doing irrigation while I listened for all the items before me, but I forgot how fun it is, like a legal non-conforming accessory structure in a residential subdivision. That's intense. It was intense. But yeah, so we
Irrigation was rough.
You've all seen this before, and like Corey said, we took out the office. We were bummed about that too. It was going to be our new office building. It would be our 4th office in Centerville. We just hopped around. But COVID happened in office is weird.
I was gonna say, COVID.
It's tricky stuff.
Yeah.
So the market kind of dictated that we go this direction. Everything else is the same. The vehicle sales, I think we addressed last time we were with you, but it's really limited to a very specific, limited type of vehicle sales. And because it would be potentially taking up 10 stalls, that's one of the reasons we wanted to offer a bunch of extra parking. So there's no worries there for you guys or for us or for our neighbors, because we're heavily invested in this project. Other than that, I think most of the things have remained the same. The drive-through is between, I think that's 2 and 3 in the northeast where you see the drive. and that's slated, yeah, 2 and 3. And that's slated for
That'd be northwest.
thank you, northwest. You're right, and the northwest side, slated for a non-chain restaurant, just this one drive-through that we have a potential tenant that's looking at.
Could you give us an example of a non-chain restaurant?
No, because I don't know what it is.
Okay.
They don't tell me that stuff.
I think the question is queuing. That would be the next follow-up question, so, sorry.
Yeah,
Stacking is the phrase, right? Stacking.
Oh, thank you.
stacking up of the drive-through.
Yeah.
Yeah, and all that I know is that it's we've looked at some local restaurants that have expressed some interest here. So just that one drive-through, and I think the ordinance, correct me if I'm wrong, just says we can have one. There's no, so we can't sneak any more behind your back. But yeah, I think everything else remains the same. We're excited about this project. We love Centerville. We're invested in Centerville. Staff's been very patient with us as we work through this because PDOs are tricky. So we've really appreciated Lisa and Corey and Mackenzie's help. We're happy to be here, but yeah, I'm happy to answer any other questions you have.
So with regard to this drive-through, sorry, do you mind if I jump in?
Yeah, go ahead.
With regard to this drive-through, I'm trying to look at this logistically. So where would cars come in and where would they go out?
My understanding is they'd come from the north, so any stacking would probably wrap north and then to the east.
Around, like, so on this, like, wide side of building 2?
And then you exit south.
Where are the entrances?
But you have the entrances there, yeah, exactly, good point, Christina.
Well, there's an entrance further to the east, right?
Well, there's 4 units, each
Isn't it-
with,
Yeah, it all
Double
comes from
doors.
there, right?
I believe there's some on the south as well, entrances
those
to
look
the
like
to
service
the-
Entrance to
entrances, though,
the retail
Mackenzie.
units?
Yeah.
They're on the north.
Oh, the entrance to the building is on the,
Yeah.
Correct, and I think where maybe Shaylin and Christina are going is if you have it stacked, say 4, 5, 6 cars deep and you're wrapping around, you're effectively blocking entrances as well as people trying to back out of their stalls along that frontage there, just to the north of building 2.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
You know, it does make sense. And I think given the, the sensitivity in the city to stacking, given, Chick-fil-A is a perfect example of,
Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out.
and in and out.
And DQ.
Yes.
Yeah.
And
Chick-fil-A,
DQ, yes.
In-N-Out,
You have
I
3
mean, we
big
have a
ones.
situation.
And almost sometimes with Twisted Sugar out on a main street.
Yes.
Twisted Sugar is trying to join that club, yeah.
Yes.
Another
they are.
non-chain, if you, not outside of Centerville, but Nielsen's Frozen Custard.
Yes.
in
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Is
terrible.
insane.
Oh, that one's dangerous.
I agree.
But,
Yeah, I'm going to look up to tell you what it is. I think it's three or 5 stacking stalls is all our standards require, and that's why,
Really?
And that was going to be my question. Did I misunderstand? This is a legislative decision, right? So we're approving it for whatever, I mean, this is great to have a site plan, but we're not necessarily approving this site plan. We're approving whatever site plans fit the legislative decision, right?
I understood that differently.
it's a little bit hybrid. This is, any site plan from here on out has to substantially comply with
Okay,
this.
all right, so we're hybrid. Well, either way, this is where I was headed, was what are our city enforcement mechanisms for stacking issues? And are they going to be used? Because in conjunction with that, I don't like meddling too much.
sure.
We'll let the businesses take care of the businesses, and if it's a problem for them to solve on private property, but then there's when it spills out and becomes a public problem. And I'm just wondering if staff has any ideas about that.
We are very non-aggressive with our stacking. And the problem that I see with that is you have the popularity. So let's take just the market pattern of the fast food. If you go to Rancheritos, you don't need a lot of stacking. If you go to Chick-fil-A and In-N-Out, you need a lot of stacking. Part of that is that those 2 businesses on the north side, Chick-fil-A, they wanted to go to that location because all of the numbers work out from a market analysis. South of Parrish does not work out in those numbers for whatever reason that they look at. But you also have the popularity issue that's associated with it. And so, In-N-Out Burger, it was a conditional use in that. We set it up so that far lane is supposed to be used for stacking. When they opened up, they didn't park in that one set of double bays and ran 2 lines, for it, and they've gotten away from that. but they met our minimums. And the traffic study came back and said it would work there, and now you do see a problem. The Chick-fil-A is unique because we brought the same issue up with Chick-fil-A. And the owners of MTC wanted that lot, and the way they mitigated that conditional use, because it's associated, in this case, the drive-through, we don't regulate drive-throughs independently. It's based on the type of use, a bank, a fast food chain, so forth, dry cleaners. They agreed to use past where you drive down now and go back around. You see them going down that aisle? They were going to use the far side of that too in their queuing, and agreed to it under the conditional use. So technically, we could go out to enforcement, and if they stack back up, force them to return back to there. But the problem became is MTC and Chick-fil-A started disputing because the way that worked, people parking there couldn't get out at lunch.
And I guess that was my point. If you stack this up around the corner, you have a bay of stalls there where they couldn't back out when needed.
But
Even entering the whole development.
So really quickly, let's, let's, hang on, let's stay on task for a second here. Let's focus. We're listening to the applicant and addressing the questions of the applicant right now, which we're doing a great job of it, right? So.
We're asking him questions.
Yeah, so let's make sure that we stick with that, and our discussion about this can come shortly after when we get to that point,
Yeah.
so.
Chair, just so you know, on this case, it depends on the use. It'll range from 3 to 4 to 5, depending on the type of use, is all our ordinances require for stacking.
Okay.
Okay, so Mackenzie, can you back out on our little screen there? Make it, yeah, kind of back out. And can the applicant go, just for my own eyes, point it to me where you envision that cars are going to come in from the main
Whoa.
road and drive through?
From Zoom to.
I know.
This is what I envision.
This is the lovely thing about doing it in
This is
person.
something we can work with staff on, right? But from what I understand, in the earlier drawing, we had the window right here. So I think we envisioned it coming in like this.
And so where would people be coming off the main road to get into the line?
Well,
All
it
the
would
way
be
around on the other side?
Here, or they come in this direction, depending on the line. That's what we envisioned. I think that's all very workable. The thing I would offer that may be different from the other examples in Centerville is this is all on our private property in our parking lot, affecting our other tenants. So we're going to manage this. It's not going onto a road like Bountiful or a Chick-fil-A that's kind of isolated. If this detrimentally impacts our other tenants, we're going to hurt. So we're incentivized to really manage it as best we can.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the point that I was gonna make with that is, to Mason's point, we don't wanna micromanage this property, but we could, call this out as something that we've seen in the past to say, okay, meet the minimum requirements, but be mindful of potential challenges, so.
Is from the drawing on the top right, is that like a garden bed
Oh, yes. This big rectangle up here?
where you said they might drive through?
Yeah, so that there are some existing power lines from Bountiful Power with guy wires that they're not letting us move.
Oh, those are power lines.
Those are power lines.
Okay.
So we had to leave that as is.
If you have extra stalls, would you consider removing the stalls immediately north of the drive-throughs such that they can, if they stack and queue, they're stacking north as opposed to blocking stalls? I don't know, from a site plan development standpoint, I don't know if that works or not, but
I think that's something
that's an idea. Because I see if you're bringing them around, going eastbound, wrapping back around westbound, they'll actually be stacking to the north of that drive aisle, not on the south side of that drive aisle. And that's obviously part of the concern. But I also agree with Kevin and Mason that you're within the confines of your own private property, and I agree with that point. We're not spilling out onto public streets.
And I certainly think that's something we would consider. I need to look and see how many we're stacking right now. And then we're happy to work with staff to get this right. I had a question for you, Corey. If we were approved like this and then found that we needed additional stacking, could we then just repaint, remove those stalls and have a queuing line?
Yeah, the PDO says your next approvals just have to substantially comply, so there's still opportunity to shift.
Well, I'm saying if it's built, if we build it and we see what we need help with queuing, we can just go repaint those lines and create a drive aisle for that.
You do a site plan amendment, and then we
Okay.
just make sure that
Okay, that was my curiosity, thanks.
I have a different question if we're done with this,
Are we, well, for the
For the
applicant?
applicant or?
for the applicant.
Yeah, go ahead, yeah.
What, there, in the report, it talks about the stormwater system. Can you address that issue and how maybe the staff's recommending a condition to address sort of that issue with the above ground versus the,
Yeah, so the issue with the storm drain is this triangle where building 3 is, on the west side there, that is slated in the PDO and on the plat for the PDO, as storm drain, as a storm detention area. So because we're putting a building there, we are planning on putting 2 different storm drain systems underground in different parts of the site. Because of that, we have to amend the PDO to allow for that, because the PDO explicitly called out that pond
right?
as a detention area. So that requires a plat amendment and a PDO amendment to move to these underground systems. I saw in the staff report that they need some more information for those underground systems, and I think we're working with the engineering department to get that.
Yeah, I think Kevin is pretty far along. This is just
Okay.
repeating the language from the original approval because I wanted to preserve the rights for that final approval, but Kevin is further along than when this first came to
Perfect.
you.
There are some tubes in the ground out there that they're
Good.
monitoring right now.
Fantastic, thank you.
Great. Any other questions for the applicant?
Thank you. Sorry, I'm going to just jump in with one final question. That lane right there to the left of building 2, how many stack in there?
That's what I don't know. I'd have to look.
Think you could get 5? That doesn't,
I
maybe I'm
don't
not understanding the
think so.
scales
I don't know if there'd be 5 there,
Yeah,
but
no.
maybe 3.
in the lane. The reason I ask, and I'll ask Corey later, I just, I want to understand that if our minimum is up to 5, I'm just wondering if we need to make sure that it has, at a minimum, up to 5.
Well, and that's a question I have for you too, Corey, is the stacking requirements, does it say in the lane, like a designated stacking area, or, I don't know, I'm not sure. how
It
that-
just says you have to provide, based
Adequate
on
space.
use, a number of stacking stalls. It doesn't define in a lane or outside of a lane. Obviously, the commission's, cognizant that if it starts interrupting circulation, then that would be a
That's a
problem.
problem, yeah. Thank
So a
you.
question for the applicant is, could you, on a submission, depending on how we chat about it tonight, show us on the plan the actual cars from a stacking perspective?
I think
to
that's
meet
in-
that.
I think that's in our best interest. I think we're gonna look at that and
So,
get back.
to your question, Mason, the width of the building there looks like it's 70 feet, right? So, in theory, you could fit,
Maybe 5.
Pretty close.
yeah, you
Depends on the
Typical
size of the
parking stall
car.
is 9 by 18.
If it's a 350, probably not.
I have a car that would take.
Well, we have a,
A typical parking stall is 9 by 18, so
Yeah.
you're gonna get 3 stalls at a minimum at least. That would take 60 feet, so 3.5 cars potentially,
You said it's 60
plus
feet?
sides, plus
70
side-
feet.
plus sidewalk, so you might get 4 cars
4
in
cars
that space
the lane
alone
itself.
before you go out to maybe a 5th stack that would impede traffic.
Yeah.
so if they're proposing a fast food use, that's the one that's 5 stalls. So they are going to have to show 5 stalls per our dimensions.
Yeah, perfect.
And they've got some adjustments on aisle widths that they can work with to do that, and it'll adjust the lane width.
Yeah, well, I think we'll work with them to make sure we can meet the
Yeah.
ordinance and meet what we need.
Okay. All right.
Thank
you very
Thanks
much.
for the gentle hand slaps.
No,
Keep
no.
us on task.
That's all right. Okay, so this matter has been scheduled for a public hearing, and we will take the time now to open this up to the public to address anything that we've talked about. Seeing nobody rushing to the microphone, we'll go ahead and close the public hearing. and turn the time over to the commission to discuss this application. Lisa looks like Lisa has something to say. Go ahead, Lisa.
I would just like to address the question about the legislative decision. With a PDO, it's actually a zoning decision. And they get certain rights and certain densities and certain uses that other people don't. And so this whole project was approved as a PDO. So if they want to amend any of the terms and conditions of that PDO, they have to come back. And that's what they're doing, is amending their PDO. But there's also a number of governing documents against the property, like a development agreement, parking and access easements, and all of those things. So we've been working with the applicant, to see if those governing documents also need to be amended. But in my opinion, this is a plan development overlay. It is a legislative decision. The city does have the authority, in my opinion, to say, these are the kinds of uses, or do we want a drive-through or not? And I was just looking, although an older version of the development agreement amendments that were proposed is in your packet, but in the more recent red line version, we actually call out to now allow them in the development agreement one drive-through. So right now, uses just say in the development agreement, general restaurant, general retail, and general office. So we're proposing in the development agreement, which is just another layer on top of the PDO, to spell that out, that they would have that right.
So Lisa, this is a PDO amendment and a conceptual site plan.
Yes, the
together.
PDO requires the site plan to be submitted, and
So for my own benefit then, does that mean this is coming back for a final site plan, or so we'll see this
yes.
again?
You'll see a final site plan that required to, as Mr. Vance mentioned, also amend the plat, and the development agreement amendment and this PDO and the plat will all go to the city council as well. But yes, and then the planning commission will see a final site plan.
Okay. Thanks, Lisa.
And with that, with the development agreement amendment, we're saying you have to amend a lot of the exhibits to the development agreement, because this was a very specific development agreement for this project. So for instance, we spelled out where the traffic circulations for the trucks had to go. And now that they're putting buildings in different places than the original, they really have to amend a number of those. So, and not that, I think it might be helpful for the planning commission to see those proposed amendments to the development agreement, even though it's not in your jurisdiction to approve that. I think it might be helpful to see what else we're dealing with for this project.
Okay.
Hope that helps.
So,
That's good, thank
so can I ask some questions, Lisa? So, Raising Cane's, is a super popular chain. It's a lot like Chick-fil-A. Let's suppose a Raising Cane's wants to go in there. What mechanisms does the city have after we have approved all of this and everything's been put to bed, and 3 years from now, Raising Cane's comes in? What is the city going to have to enforce proper stacking and good circulation?
Well, on this one, it would be very problematic because it is private property. What we do, we get lots of complaints about Chick-fil-A and Dairy Queen. It goes to the police department when they back out onto a public street. And so the enforcement mechanism really is a citation for creating, some sort of issue and backing out onto the public street. But we have tried to work with those business owners. I think, Centerville wants to be very cooperative with our business owners, and it's a tricky thing. I mean, the police department doesn't want to go out and give citations to people waiting for Chick-fil-A. So, and this is where I'm saying it is problematic, because all we require is 5 stalls in our code. So how do you say, well, we know you're a Chick-fil-A and we want more? You can only do that if it's a PDO or a legislative decision where you have a development agreement. So that's what I'm just trying to say here is, I think we have a little bit more authority on the drive-through than just a standard site plan, because we have that PDO overlay. But I'm not trying to weigh in on the planning or the project, I'm just trying to add the legal authority that we have under a PDO. But yeah, I think it would be difficult, because what would they be, I guess you could, well, no, we don't regulate private property. unless you could say it was a violation of something in their approval, you know, and then it'd be a zoning issue, but it's difficult.
They do have every incentive not to allow for stacking in a way that would harm all of the other businesses there. I mean, I do think that that is a realistic protection, just from a sheer practical standpoint.
And some of the business owners, for instance, the, you know, Chick-fil-A, you know, or Sonic, they put in 2 drive lanes, and, you know, and then they go out and they've done some great things. I mean, our businesses with drive-throughs, they've gone out and they say, hey, we want to, you know, they send their people out there to take the orders even faster. And so, but, you know, if a place is really popular, our code just doesn't design to that.
We're not planning for popular, is that what you're saying? Just kidding, I'm just kidding, Lisa.
That could be our new tagline in Centerville.
Just kidding.
You said it.
Well, that summed it up.
Don't even go there. Okay, back on task, Kevin.
But I agree with Shaden as well, that typically, and especially in the case of this type of a site plan, the private property owners are incentivized to ensure proper flow, whereas some others that don't have multiple uses or multiple tenants in it, they could care less if it goes out on the frontage road or anywhere else, because, hey, that's not my problem. That's not my problem. And so I would give kudos to Quick Quack. I mean, to Lisa's point, I think they generally stack pretty deeply. When we had our dust storm, they actually went out and they were doing a little traffic control on their own volition, as opposed to some of these others that seem to not really care, so.
Yeah. Okay. Anybody else have any thoughts, comments?
Will you entertain a motion?
I will.
I hereby make a motion for the Planning Commission to recommend approval for lots 2 and 3 of the Legacy Crossing at Parish Lane Development, subject to conditions 1 through 3 in the staff report for suggested reasons A through F.
Second?
Spencer. Great, so we have a motion and a second. Any further discussion on the motion? Okay. Then we will start down at this other end with Commissioner Wilcox.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye?
Aye.
Nay.
Aye.
Okay, so the motion passes, and thank you. We look forward to seeing this again for final site plan, not for another conditional, right?
Chair Daly, would you entertain a stray comment?
You bet. Be the first one of the night.
Yeah, several years ago, Becky had recommended that we identify in our agenda whether something is a legislative or administrative decision, and I think that's been a really good idea. But it occurs to me that we call it a legislative decision, but really it's more of a it's a legislative recommendation, and decision makes it sound like we are making the decision, which is not
We're not a
accurate.
legislative body.
And so for purposes of helping the public better understand the distinction between the two, I would suggest that we say administrative decision and legislative recommendation to distinguish more clearly between the two types of decisions, for what it's worth. I think it would better help our public
Good suggestion.
understand.
Yeah, I like that.
So for what it's worth, there's my stray comment.
That's good. Okay. Yeah, I like that. So that's something I think we can do, right?
Yeah, we could do that.
Okay. All right, let's move along then to the next item on our agenda. We're going to talk about accessory dwelling units, and we've got some draft discussion ideas. Corey?
Thank you, Chair Daly. I'm just going to go to the memo part and just kind of talk about some general parameters to set this up, and then you can have your discussion on it. The intention tonight is just to discuss the draft, the commission to become familiar with the draft ideas, share your critiques, concerns, ideas, and so forth, and we can start including those into that draft, and then come back later for the official zone text amendment to go through the process in the public hearing. So this is where you can roll up your sleeves and get them a little bit dirty and figure out what you want to do. So in working with Lisa on this draft, she made some good points in some of the discussion, and so I tried to capture those in my memo. So I'm just going to go over why we're here. The state legislature this past session has required all municipalities and counties to address accessory dwelling units. In the case of the state statute, they're only addressing internal accessory dwelling units. So this would be inside the main single-family home. This would not be something that's built separated from the home. And so because of past discussions, I limited this ordinance just to comply with state code from that perspective, and didn't anticipate we'd have the temperature at this point in time to address whether we wanted to go down the road of detached. I figure that's something we can test this one out on, come back later and look for it. One of the understandings in our legislative sessions at the Utah chapter, the Planning Association chapter, is we are required to zone up to 75% of our single-family area to allow ADUs. What's interesting attached to that 75% rather than 100% is you can designate areas to exclude ADUs from. The experience that most cities who have already crossed this threshold with recent ADU ordinances comes down to how do you define that? How do you set a parameter that sits and says, this area you can't do it, this area you can? And I know we can think of myriad of ways to come up with those ideas. The recommendation among the planning community is to not do that. Don't get into that discussion. I feel safe given Centerville because we're not a community with a college town. North Salt Lake has passed it, and the feedback we're getting from cities is it's less than 1% of their housing stock converts to ADUs. And so to me, unless we think we're going to have a floodgate to it, and I know we kind of plan conservatively, but the numbers are showing that not everybody is finding the appeal for ADUs. So for me to think about, well, how would I say which area should and shouldn't became resulted back. But you need to know, we need to have that, if we want to exclude, we have a deadline of October to do that exclusion. And then it's opened up to all of our single-family areas. For us, it's the single-family zones of agricultural low and residential low. So that's our predominant single-family districts in the city. We're probably somewhere around a little over 5,000 units in the city. So, plus or minus a little bit from the old numbers.
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So if it's not, so if you are zoned for something other than single family, the ADU would not apply. We're only talking about single family designations.
The target of the state legislation went to single-family districts, single-family uses as the main primary use. There are some exclusions under that. You can restrict it for lots less than 6,000 square feet or smaller, which I did include into it. Mobile home trailers, things like that you were used as single family but are excluded from the use of the internal.
And that's because one of my questions, Shaylin, was based off of where you have some of our tight townhomes that maybe only have one garage, you wouldn't want that applicable to.
Right,
So,
right.
That's correct.
The other thing that I've put into this draft ordinance, and you'd have to probably think about, because Centerville in its zoning ordinance has a permitted use chapter that's enforced by the zoning administrator. And the zoning administrator has approval under that chapter to approve all permitted uses. But if you go over to the site plan process, the only permitted use that the zoning administrator actually reviews is single-family development under the building permit parameters. So there is very little under that broad power of the ordinance for the zoning administrator to do permitted uses. So accessory buildings, single-family homes with your building permit, that's typically what I approve. I'm adding single-family homes to be approved by the language by the zoning administrator. So I think that's something you have to discuss. Are you willing to open up that authority of the zoning administrator to review ADUs? My rationale for it is, because this is a state, we're supposed to allow them as internal. My concern is that we don't do a good job in the planning profession as a whole about the civic reviews of what the commission does and what you can improve and what you can't. And when we always use a conceptual site plan for a public hearing, it's often confused that you have the discretion to simply vote no. So why aren't you voting no? And so we have that ongoing battle. But I think commercial development, large multifamily projects, it's worth that tension to try to educate the public with and go through those disappointments. With it being internally located, if the standards are up to muster for the city, it just should be put in a zoning administrator's position. We're obligated to define it, we're obligated to allow them, and if you feel, and this is what's really important, that we've had debates in the city in the past, you have to be comfortable with your standard. If you're uncomfortable with your standard, there's a way to always peel back, be more conservative, put it into conditional uses, then your conditional use is subjective, and we get into all these arguments, but you have to be comfortable that this is what you want to do, comfortable with the regulations, and but I just think that's an important point to make, but I think the ordinance to general data is pretty robust. The third point is, Lisa brought this up, we have a lot of definitions, main building, primary buildings, and it can get awfully confusing within the ordinance. So Lisa suggested that inside the ADU ordinance, we just be very disciplined. Internal ADUs, and it's always called out as internal ADUs, and we define it, and primary single-family dwellings. So we define that, so that when we're dealing with ADUs, we stay in the same framework of interpretations. Another thing that the state did is allow cities, not allow cities, but they defined the difference between accessory dwelling unit and short-term rentals.
That's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, so the state set that at 30 days, so the ordinance reflects that 30 days. And so that may be a concern of enforcement. That was a large discussion about that. So they did relax. It's funny how the state works. You know, they control the short-term rentals. They haven't solved it with the hotels. This has been going on for a couple of years. We've not finished out the short-term rental at the state level. And so they said at the state, you cannot use cities. If you have call it a lodging facility, you can't use VBRO and Airbnb to use your enforcement. If it's listed on there, you can't use that as evidence. So it makes you dig a little harder and a little deeper for your enforcement. ADUs, they stepped back and said, oh, by the way, if you have an ADU, you can use those advertisements for enforcement. Go figure, it's an interesting debates at the state. One of the things that's in here is the state law, Lisa pointed this out, it says existing primary single-family dwellings. So the assumption is that the house is there, and somebody wants to do this, and here's what you're doing. The language of the ordinance broadens that. And that's something to talk about. Could somebody do an addition to allow an ADU? And how does that come into play? And The way it's written is yes, you can do an addition, but here are all of the other things about remodeling your home. And this is the tension. State on one side said you can't regulate the materials on single-family dwellings anymore. But then it goes in and says, but you can regulate that in ADUs that the single-family dwelling has to keep the residential character. Left hand, right hand, not very clear. So as you see, I don't really go in to regulate materials per se. It's the design of the building. And so this is built to allow you to do an addition to your home, provided that you're matching the design of the home, and this is how we're going to look at it. So that's something for you to discuss. Rationale behind it. I know of several accessory buildings as of late, the last couple of years, that they've been anticipating the ADU ordinance. And they've been building their accessory buildings, hoping that comes into play. And the trick they always do is they eliminate the kitchen, and hot plates and microwaves and crock pots are not counted in kitchen facilities. And so these facilities, that's what they're using in them. Now, I haven't gone in to see if somehow an oven was slipped in and plugged into the 110 outlet. And who knows, that may have, that happens. But that tangent is to tell you that I think people who want to do it will figure out a way to do something and hope something comes down the road. So when you say existing single-family dwelling, there's an easy circumvent. Come in this year, do an addition, doesn't show an ADU, and then later convert that area now into the ADU after that permit's expired. And so that's my, what do I call it? That's my evil side, thinking what people will do. And so I'm just jumping to it. If you want to do an addition on your home, expand some of your space, put it into an ADU, match the character of your building, and let's move forward. Let's not play the 2-permit game to go through it. But I think it's something to discuss.
If I could just add to that, I think it's a hyper-technical reading. I just think with the definition, it says that an ADU is in an existing primary dwelling.
Right.
But it also says that you can put an ADU in a primary dwelling either at the time of construction or, that's already existing. And then it also says that you can you can convert your garage to an ADU. So, to me, I like Corey's drafting to say, look, you can put a little addition and put an ADU there, because I think, as he said, people are going to get there anyway, so.
If they really want to do it, they'll get there. The one thing that I too, in the crafting of the ordinance, and maybe Lisa can weigh in, the state went in and started changing the definition of families and just started talking about, here's the number of individuals, and getting away for Pandora's box of what constitutes a family. And Centerville's probably needs to fix their family definition to refine it to match that. But this is the idea that, to me, there's these mother-in-law apartment areas that may not be ADUs, and they get on the real estate and say, I got a mother-in-law apartment, and people say, call me up and say, hey, can I rent this mother-in-law apartment out? And, we get into the argument, well, mother-in-law, technically, if it's a relative, they can live there, and it's not the issue of whether it's apartment or not. And so I just wrote it the more black and white. If a family wants to live and the number of people matches state code, and you want to live in the house, feel free, we're not involved. But if you want to start parsing off a portion of the building, you want to start separating it, regardless of who's living in there, it's an ADU. So let's just get away from, well, I'm doing this, and my mom is going to live here, or my father's going to live here because of ill health, or my daughter's going to live here. I just thought, cut that chase and just, you're doing this, it's an ADU. And we don't care who's living in it. It's just not an issue of who's living in it. The other thing that was brought up that I didn't put in the draft, but was brought up by Commissioner Summerhays, was the second kitchen letter. That one just escaped my mind, but when you said that, I was like, oh, yes, we probably got 20, 30 of them out there. So Lisa took it and wrote in this issue of the second kitchen, which I think was a smart feedback, because I just missed that, thinking, oh, what if somebody had a second kitchen? How does that conflict? And then one thing Lisa mentioned, I have two places that I think are robust. One, the character of an addition, if you're building it. If it's part of the original construction, it obviously probably will. But the other issue is how we define owner occupancy, because the state says it has to be owner occupied. But now we go down, what does that mean? You know, is it somebody who, a trust owns it, and whatever they can do within the trust to say that it's owner occupied? And so I go down a deeper place for the owner occupancy and walk into the licensing program, because it does say we can license. The question is what does that mean that we can license them? And so I walk a very depth road. Method to the madness. I think people are uncomfortable with watching their single-family neighborhoods turn into duplexes. I think the common complaint that you always hear at ADU discussions is, I bought a single-family home in a single-family neighborhood, and that's what I expect. And so the question becomes is, rather than let somebody play around and skirt the issues that are associated with owner occupancy, I'm trying to write into, these are the rules of owner occupancy, and you got to live there half of the year, and it's got to be somebody that we can trace back to the ownership. And you promise on my honor, cross my heart, hope to die, that I'm really living in this unit, because I can see where we could find duplexes sneaking in over time. And I'm creating that tool that if we can find an enforcement, we have teeth to the enforcement to say, yeah, this is not an ADU, this is a hidden duplex in a neighborhood. I don't know if that's important. It seems to be important to me for Centerville to keep that
Or you
refinement.
bring up a good point about if a trust owns it, how do you define the primary owner? Is it, or for that matter, you may say, what if an LC owns it? Are you going to say that the primary owner is the largest or majority member of the LC? That is getting into the weeds, like you said, but
Yeah,
that may
and
be an issue. So how do you?
And that's where I'm thinking that this licensing and stuff, it's uncomfortable to go too far for licensing in this, so we don't run afoul of the state and get in trouble that we're trying to prohibit these. But at the same time, I think it's a licensing of who's in there and who's committing to be living in there. And we want to know up front. But then I go in and say, you know, the aggressive language, if you abandon it, you have to remove something. I see it being the kitchen facilities, likely the choice at hand. Whether that changes anything, I don't know, but choice at hand. But then my mind went down, what if I have to go work somewhere for a short period of time? What if I need to do something and I'm not there 6 months? So I put in the sabbatical type, job, temporary job, relocations. Somebody's in the military and they get relocated, that you can have up to this period of time, and you come to the process with the city to get that temporary waiver. Now, could somebody use it and get a temporary waiver every time, you know, once a year? I guess we could be more robust. But that's my mind thinking. I'm trying to match it to the personality of Centerville. It goes down deep. Sometimes, like Lisa says, you're parsing and splitting hairs way too deep now, and so I'm just open to your feedback now. Just, are we somewhere in the neighborhood, 50%, 60%?
So Corey, kind of since we're ending up on that area right there as far as the owner occupancy goes, you have in here, an owner is defined as a person having at least 50% or greater interest in the property.
Yeah.
Is that 50%, is that a number you just kind of started there, you pulled that out of air? Is that something that's established somewhere else in code? Is that?
That's an example of a lot of existing ADU ordinances. That's stolen from, I didn't reinvent the wheel a lot on this ordinance. I took 4 or 5 ordinances around the state that I was able to get a hold of looked at how they handled some things and then reformatted ideas to match Centerville. And the 50% is the common one that just shows up. So it's arbitrary, like setback, 25, 30, 24, 50%. A lot of them are going down that road.
Okay.
So wait, if I have 3 siblings, all of whom own a house, and who only have a 33% share, who is my owner?
That's.
Nobody.
Shaylin, you're, I think all of us were like, okay, well, if you have
That's-
the LC and it's thirds ownership.
Yeah, I
you're
think
saying
it's
that
interesting, like, maybe we could put in a
there-
clause just for, like, if, and say, if the single-family dwelling is owned by an entity or a trust, the trust has to submit a document designating one person to be
Right.
the owner, or something like that, where, so they'd have to adopt a resolution or something that said this, because that's a great point, nobody would own it. So under that, they wouldn't qualify. And my question is, does any trust qualify, because we say a person?
Yeah, and that's
Well,
what I like.
no
doing.
person has a 50% interest because the LLC owns it. So if I was reading that, I'd say, no, you can't. If you put your home in a trust, you're not a person.
And
That might be a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you view
Well,
it.
I like what you're saying, Lisa, because if it is owned by a person or persons, that's easy. Outside of that, then maybe you have the default that says that you designate someone as the owner occupant.
I mean, I could see, maybe excluding LLCs, but, a lot of couples or, they put it into a trust.
Family
And
trusts
it's
are very
still a
common.
single, it's not a rental unit, it's, so I think that's a really interesting point, Corey, that I hadn't thought about.
Yeah, I think, I kind of like the idea of designating somebody as an owner. That simplifies the process. There are ways, obviously, and we deal with this with my profession and lending and stuff, is to try and drill down and figure out who has, some ownership interest, and that gets messy.
But the owner, let's say it is in an LLC, and then, we don't want to just say you can designate someone because they're going to rent it to them. It really has to be somebody that has an ownership interest in the LLC and that's living there.
Sure, so maybe that's
Sorry,
what,
yes,
so maybe
that's
that's
a
what you
great
say.
point,
That's a
Lee.
clarification to say they have to have some ownership interest in it.
Whoa,
And
wait. But then I give the person like a 0.00001%
Right.
ownership interest.
So
There's
maybe we
always
just,
ways around it.
we could leave it like this and wait until a trust or an LLC comes in and wants an ADU, and then we'll study this one issue and amend the code to allow.
But do we care, Shaylin, if somebody owns .001, so long as an individual or individuals have been designated as the owner occupant? Do we really care?
And agree to those terms.
Yeah. Does it matter if it's 5, 10, 33, 49, or .001, so long as they've designated someone?
I think that the likelihood that people would try to get around it in the way that I've proposed is highly unlikely. Nobody wants to give up ownership in anything. So I kind of like the designation option.
Lisa, how much can we delegate to the city on the licensing requirement? In other words, a lot of this multiplication of scenarios, when we try to embed it into an ordinance, kind of locks us in, and I'd rather leave us a little more nimble. Can we at some point just say something like, in order to have an ADU, you have to go through a certain licensing, and you have to be able to designate somebody that we're going to authorize, and then we'll leave that to staff and some policy decisions about what should we do for entities.
Yeah, I think you can do it both ways. Obviously, as Corey mentioned at our last meeting, you could have a 1,000-page, zoning code if you want to spell everything out, but I also don't want to put too much on staff that, to make a gap. And so this one's interesting. I think, it could go either way, but someone could also interpret this that that's not a person. An entity, an LLC, or, I guess, yeah. So I'm satisfied because staff could interpret, if the zoning administrator is interpreting this and is given the authority, he or she can interpret person, and person may be an entity or an individual, and that might be how it's interpreted, and then the zoning administrator determines. So, yeah, if you don't want us to solve it right now, we don't have to, but the zoning administrator will have to interpret it and implement.
Okay, but let me ask my original question, because I appreciate the LLC distinction, but What if you have three siblings who inherit a home, right? Their parents died, the siblings all get a third, a third, a third. Are they all considered 100% owners, third owners? Does it depend on how many people are in there? How do you define then that for the 50% or greater interest?
Well, maybe you just say, if you don't have a 50% interest, we don't want to deal with all of these scenarios, and so maybe they're just not eligible. I mean, that's one thing. It depends how you define it. Or you could define it as ownership interest in the LLC, and that would be 30%, so they wouldn't meet our code right now.
And I don't like the idea of penalizing, particularly, think about that scenario. Mom or dad dies or both die, the siblings inherit the house, they split it third, and then to make matters worse, the city said, oh, sorry, you can't occupy the house that was just passed down to you.
We're saying one of them has to.
No, but that still wouldn't qualify under this definition though, because one sibling could say, I'm gonna live in mom, dad's house, but now I can't ADU it out because I'm only a third owner.
Sorry, that's what I'm saying. So, yes. And the family would, and the other siblings may say, we were gonna split the proceeds of that ADU, and I don't think we wanna hamstring them, because the spirit of the ADU legislation is to promote that, if people so choose.
Well, I think that's why you say somebody with a person with an ownership interest and then designate the owner or whatever, right?
I don't think you need percentages. You just say ownership interest. Keeps it simple.
Yeah. Get rid of the percentage, ownership interest, designated owner.
I don't think that's a great idea. Ownership interest could mean as little as 1%.
Sure, but again, to
But like I
Shayla's point,
said,
Right.
like Shaylin
But
said,
this-
is
the likelihood of
So
somebody.
play that one out, Mason. Why do you care
I don't think
if we've
I don't think we
designated
need to,
somebody?
because I think that there's a way to craft this where you can say, since everybody's coming in for an ADU license, just have some internal policies, and then we'll cross the bridges when we come to them. There's only gonna be 2 or 3 bridges to cross any given year. And staff are gonna be better to do that than we will in legislating it.
So
But
you-
from my understanding is if we don't say something and it's pretty broad, they get a pass, and then we can fix it.
Right, and I just
So-
think that we can, unless I'm wrong, and I will defer to you two to that, because you know it better than I do. I don't think this is gonna be an onerous burden, and I think that you guys know better than we do what we'd be looking for. You'd also be able to make the judgment call about, you know what, you're trying to skirt the rule here. But
And also remember that the appeals process, so let's just say the zoning administrator makes a not great decision on the interest part, and they can prove their argument. The Board of Adjustment can reset that.
I just hate to have somebody have to go to the Board of Adjustment.
I agree with it, but
yeah, but that's only if you have a really, really bad
Yeah,
city
and
employee.
yeah, that's
Right.
true.
I mean,
Well-
I'm being glib, but
I know.
I don't know, I have a lot of faith in city employees.
Here's the other thing that is probably more accurate as well, is if we say, yes, these are, approved, and the state has said that, how many people are going to come in and get a permit for their son or daughter that's gonna live in their basement?
Well, they have to.
Oh, they have to? How many are gonna do it?
Well, it's the same.
I'm just
Yeah,
saying.
it's the same argument as how many people come in for, I mean, there's plenty of illegal ones out there
I was
anyways.
gonna say,
Oh, there's plenty of ADUs already out there.
I just
Yeah.
think that now that if it were common knowledge in the city, in the state, blah, 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 all these things, people will feel a lot more free, and no one's gonna think twice about coming in. They should. They should do that. I'm just, in practice, thinking that probably won't happen.
If most cities are adopting the 50%, I mean, this is where we have a learning curve. And so I think that Lisa does make a good point that, if we start out that this is a baseline, this is what most cities are doing. And if we feel like we need to make some adjustments to it down the road, because we do have lots of LLCs or trusts or, sibling situations, then we could always look at making a change. This way, at least we're kind of muddling along with everybody else. I mean, there is some
Yeah.
potential wisdom in that.
Shaylin brings up a good point. Let's just get something in, and then I would suggest one additional thing, that in addition to the temporary owner absence waiver, that there be an administrative waiver for exceptional conditions. And then that wraps in I think my approach as well.
That sounds like a huge hole.
I know,
I was gonna say.
oh
I
well,
mean, you mean the zoning administrator could waive anything in this section
not
of the
anything,
code?
but specifically when we're talking about the owner occupancy,
Oh.
that as designated, that it meets the intent of this section, that this subsection
Well, you
is.
could just, so that, you know, if you go down that road, the zoning administrator required to make findings and ownership expectations.
But I don't think you need a waiver, because what you just said is you're going to allow staff to interpret this provision.
Yeah.
True,
I think they need a waiver.
but as soon as you put in a percentage, that locks them in, and I think that you would need.
Oh, you're leaving
I'm
it-
looking for flex,
That's
I'm
what I
looking
don't
for
want a
flexibility.
percentage.
But if that's uncomfortable or discomforting, I'm fine with that. We could get it on
And
the
I-
books
and
and
I-
move forward and see how things go.
And I am kind of leaning more towards the Kevin, Becky camp where, hey, if you have a percentage interest, designate someone, away you go.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the reason for me thinking of that is, yeah, Shaylin, you're right. Everybody else is doing this. Let's just throw something out there. Let's get started with something. But I think we've identified what in my opinion is a fairly feasible, possible, likely scenario where somebody comes in and you've got a third, or a 20, right? And that presents problems. And so let's address that right now while we're talking about it, get that out of the way, and save our energy for fixing other things that come up later that we haven't identified yet.
Well, and if you think of the hypothetical too, it's probably gonna be a lot more typical to have a third, or whatever, than somebody like designating I mean, if someone's really gonna go to that effort, that likelihood, that hypothetical, if we're building our whole ordinance over that tiny, insignificant, minuscule hypothetical, I think we're kind of missing the point.
The flip side of my same argument is we could go that direction, and if we find that people are abusing it, then we can always
Exactly.
tighten our ordinances. The downside is that if we've already thrown open the floodgates, sometimes it's harder to ratchet it back versus starting slow and then.
Yeah.
And the
widening.
purpose of it is to at least identify an owner occupant, right? Regardless if it's .01, so long as we've identified the owner occupant. I think that, in my mind, again, I don't really care if they're 10, 20, 50, 49, .01. We've designated the owner occupant, and we've kind of relieved a burden from staff where they don't have to be the interpreters. It is what it is, and away we go. Will there be some holes that we figure out that we haven't thought through? I suppose so, but
Yeah.
so long as we require them to designate that owner occupant through that process, I think that kind of helps us relieve burdens within, from a staffing and from a legislative language that we recommend to the city council.
So the owner occupancy affidavit that we talk about here, I guess, as part of that affidavit, the person would
Tell us.
identify themselves as an owner, and that's their affidavit of ownership, or,
Yeah,
okay.
they'd make that claim.
Do you need to add on the temporary absence waiver any religious assignment? Or is that a sabbatical leave? Is that the same?
Yeah, the broad interpretation of sabbatical leave could include that, but that's technically by Merriam Dictionary, not a religious. That's why I chose this such as, to give it an opportunity. So that somebody interpreting the ordinance later it's not these
They
two
have people
items.
leaving on a
It's,
church mission
yeah.
in our community.
So I see this, the statute says that it's effective October 1, 2021. So I'm assuming we have to get something in place, but then our code will also be effective October 1. So I think as Corey and I were talking, this is a new direction, and you can certainly table it and have staff look at some other definitions. I was just looking at Salt Lake County's definition of owner occupancy, or, we could look at some other ones, and
Well, we're not voting on this tonight, right? Because it hasn't been noticed.
No, you're just giving feedback.
This
So,
is
yeah,
just
just-
discussion. So,
so I think that's one thing to send back to staff.
I'm gonna say staff
Owner-
needs,
Let's think about owner occupancy.
Yeah, so staff has time to go back and talk about it still, or needs to anyway.
Yeah.
Sandy might be a good one because you have some of these, tourists where they want to use it, maybe skirt around for skiing, some of those,
City.
Park City, yes. That'd be maybe a good reference point for us as we try to
Grand
track.
County,
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, yes, actually.
this is where half the debate at the legislature was occurring.
Yeah, so I think it would be good to have staff go back and kind of revisit what it means to be owner occupant and
We can do that.
With regard to the temporary owner absence waiver, what's the difference between subsection 3, medical or other care of other family members, and 6, personal illness?
Probably not much. I'm just drafting an ordinance trying to cover bases.
The way I read that was that in the first one, you're going to California to care for your sick mom, and the other one,
Okay.
you're going into a care home because you were sick.
That's how I read it too.
Okay.
One related to a third part, a different person, and 6 related to you yourself.
They're
Got
related
it.
enough that you could,
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. Do we need to
Define that.
parse them out,
Yeah,
or can
or
we
they
just
wanted to
say, medical, personal illness, or care of,
Yeah,
care
we
of
could leave it at
relative?
that.
Yeah.
Educational pursuits, that could be so many things.
Yeah, what are we worried about percent interest when we're educational pursuits?
Since we maybe have 15 more minutes, I just had a question about the parking, and I can't remember, Corey, if I brought this up, but I think it was intentional, but it might be helpful to bring this up with the commission, that the parking does say that at least one additional parking space has to be provided for the ADU. But then later in that paragraph, we say, but that space can be in tandem with the primary use.
Right, but if you read it, it's the idea of that the tandem is all parking is behind the front setback. But what I'm trying to be flexible is if you have a deeper garage and you have space, we're not requiring you to go to the side of the garage if you can meet the setback. You just have to have 3 parking stalls, all of them being behind the setback, but the ADU can be a tandem stall.
Okay, so for instance, if you have a really long driveway and you've got your 2 cars for the primary dwelling, and you can still get one more, or
In tandem.
you actually have 4, then that works for
Yeah.
the ADU. You don't have to provide another one.
Right.
how would the city go about enforcing street parking? Everybody gets to park on the street.
I think that's what cities do, is they say you have to provide it, but you can't make them use it.
That's sort of what I was-
Well, I think where it becomes an issue is in the winter, right? When you can't park on the street, and like, where are you gonna park? So you gotta provide it so that it's there for,
Yeah, during the wintertime.
during the winter, you know?
But that's kind of I guess I'm just worried about this tandem, because let's say I already have 3 cars.
Then you've provided the third.
Then what?
You've already provided 3 parking now. You're good.
It does
But
cause
Lisa's
problems.
point is if you already have 3, and then you have another ADU, introduced a 4th, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, we're really not requiring an extra stall for the ADU if you already have.
And Corey, you're saying, well,
Stalls.
ordinance may only require 2, and you're already.
Ordinance only
providing-
requires 2,
And you're already providing 3, and that's a personal choice to have 3 vehicles as opposed to 2 vehicles.
That's true.
So it's anything just in a driveway, that would work, or?
if the stall, people park in their driveways all the time, consistently, because we use garages as our A1 storage shed. But the 2 actual legal stalls is your garage, because it sits behind this setback. And so this is kind of the same concept of, you can add another parking stall, the state says we can do that. To me, it's worthwhile because we have the issue of snow and everything else. But the idea is, your parking is back there, because some people convert a garage. Okay, where are you gonna put those other 2 stalls? And as long as you can provide 3 stalls behind the front setback, that third one can be tandem. I'm not trying to force it to be side by side by side. If you want to, great. You want to use your RV parking area as the third stall, feel free. As long as it's all behind the setback. But though, everybody parks in the driveway. Just, Who hardly parks in their garage anymore? Only me,
I'm a
because
garage parker. We do. Big time.
2-car garage, 2 cars in the garage. That's us.
I'm very, very disciplined with my garage.
3-car garage, 2 inside, 3 outside, and then there's all the friends. And I park in front of my mailbox and I get ticketed for it.
I can verify that, looking just down the street.
That was the most grumpy dad answer I've ever.
And then they get in my way.
Well, one of them is in stock for the one under the
Well, we finally got rid of that one.
Yeah, okay.
Do you guys live near each other?
2 houses
Kitty
down.
corner.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
I really like this ordinance. I think we're at 98%.
Yeah.
I am not specifically sold on the owner occupancy. I think that we're actually setting us up to prohibit when I would rather prefer that we see ADUs. I would like some flexibility there, but I'll defer to wherever we go. Whatever you guys produce, I'm very likely going to be in favor of recommending with a positive recommendation. This is great.
I think we can go back and
Yeah.
have a discussion about it.
So I think unless somebody has other major items that they'd like to discuss, I think we've had some good discussions and topics and enough for staff to go back, revisit it, and then notice it and bring it back, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because we got a tight deadline, right? I mean, October 1 will be here.
Well, 'cause
I hate to say it.
We've got to approve it and the city council's got to approve
From
it.
a
Yeah.
commission and council timeframe.
That's true.
Yeah.
Dare I ask, do we need to worry about the landing pad as it goes through the city council? Is there going to be a lot of pushback?
You never know.
Should we just no comment that and then move on?
But statutorily, aren't we required?
Well,
to?
I'm
We gotta
talking
do
more
something.
about, like, sometimes there's just a sense of ADUs. And
But they have to, right?
not necessarily.
No, but I think that for the city council, you know, if the concern is what, you know, they have to act on it, right?
It's like Grumpy Dad's coming out again.
Right now.
The city council can easily blame the legislature for this, like, hey.
I guess what I'm trying to say is, do we need to craft anything to help ease the landing?
That's why I stuck with just the internal ADUs.
Do we know
and
the temperature, like, are there hot buttons that the city council will
Maybe
talk about when it gets to them?
I should probably withdraw the question. Let's move on. I'm
Well,
sorry.
it is in our general plan as one of our moderate income housing agenda
Yeah.
goals, and we only have 3
They did
goals.
remove it.
And they
the current
adopted
city
the
council.
ADUs along the transportation corridor
Removed ADUs.
in our last amendment.
When they've been on.
This is just gonna go broaden that horizon. And I predict that as we send out notices, you know, there's some that are already asking where we're at. Some of them because they want them, some of them because they don't want them. I think it'll get a little difficult as we go through the process.
And remind me, what happens if we don't, or if the council doesn't approve?
I retire.
Oh, careful, Corey.
The state rules, Mason just said, the state rules will default if we don't as a
Yeah.
city adopt, okay. Which will be more strict, or?
No, it'll be less. Because they turn over your ability to regulate some things, but if you don't regulate them, they get to go do it.
I think from our perspective, we'd like to,
We want to have a say.
we want to manage what happens in our city, right?
But I think that's a good point. of
Correct.
Just staff presentation at the council and educating the public that, yeah, these are your choices, given the legislation.
But you're right, I did set myself up. This is the way we can get rid of Corey.
Wow. All right. On that note,
That'd be a loss.
so just, all right, so moving on. The next item on the agenda is the land use training. This is going to be a self-study item, right, Lisa?
Yes,
Lisa has been very busy with stuff. She has prepared information for us, but we're gonna do that on your own. So. And then we'll go on to the next item on the agenda, this Community Development Director's Report and City Council Report. Corey.
Thank you, Chair Daly. We've actually added a second item, so we have Canyon Point scheduled for your next meeting. That's around 400 East, 400 North. There's some residential medium property. It's not right at the corner, but there's some infill to come into that project. We have, I think it's called The Lane. This is the Bell property behind Dave's Auto that has the White House in the center. That's called The Lane, and so that's tentatively scheduled for your meeting. The question becomes, and I may not put it on there, the proposed zone text amendments, I may pull that off as we discuss some things for the ADUs and then get back to you, but it will be fairly short, come back to you fairly shortly. The other thing is the bylaws were approved at the City Council. Mackenzie attended that and did well, fending all the questions that came to her about it. And then the joint work session, they have tentatively scheduled to July 6, 5:30 PM for goals.
So that is Tuesday.
I'm asked to feedback, where is the commission at? Is that a workable date?
I'm available. Is anybody else available? Anybody not available on that date?
I am not available,
Okay.
but I matter at the very least. I'm not even sure how much longer I'm going to be on the planning commission, so,
Are you staying until that we have a new commissioner?
yeah.
And there's nobody taking the applications and putting them into the shredder.
Here's a loophole.
For sure.
It's probably why I got so emotional. I was walking through the door today. I really did not expect to get that emotional, but I was thinking, this could be the last time. I have no idea. I could be walking through this door multiple more times, but this could be the last. I don't know. It was a weird feeling.
Yeah, that is a weird feeling. All right, Corey, Will, and besides?
I'm available.
I'm available.
Okay.
So it's okay to report back?
Yep.
Okay.
Let's do it. So Corey, real quickly, question for you. That Canyon Point you're talking about, is that property that we've seen in the past, long ago?
Long ago.
Martha's something, was it called before?
Yeah, it wasn't Martha's Vineyard, but maybe
Yeah.
something.
Didn't it have Martha?
Martha's Court or something like that.
Martha's Place?
So are
Martha's Place.
Martha's
I think it
Place.
was
Martha's
Martha's
Place.
Are
Place.
these going to be east of the existing
It's
newish
gonna
ones?
be- It will be,
There's a house off the corner, the little small house off the corner on 400 East on the west side of the road. It'll be infill. They've bought a couple of homes also now, so.
So there will still be some single family between?
well, so this is zoned residential medium.
Yeah, it's mid.
Across here. And so that means this is zoned residential medium as well. And so it comes into the back, and I think one of these homes is included in the deal, so.
You said 400 east, 400 north?
Yeah, that's what I was kind of looking up.
It's the one where the neighbor didn't want them to remove trees, remember?
Yeah. Okay, we'll talk about that next time. Let's go on to our minutes from the last meeting. It's a short 3-pager. Go through this really quickly, page by page. Does anybody have any recommended changes for page 1? Page 2? Page 3? Perfect. I will entertain a motion.
Motion? Go ahead, Becky. Go ahead, Becky.
I move to accept the minutes from the June 9th, 2021 Planning Commission meeting as unamended.
Second? Spencer?
Spencer. All right, so we have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Great, that passes unanimously. I move that we adjourn.
Second. Do we have the second?
Yes.
Yeah.
We have a motion and a second. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Great, we are adjourned.